Welcome to Unknown Lovely Tales, a story of love, betrayal, and revenge that will take you to the darkest corners of fate. But what happens next? Will she find justice, or will she lose herself in the fire of vengeance? This story isn't just about words, it's about emotions. So if you're looking for something unique and unforgettable, stay with us till the end. Now, grab your coffee, sit back, and let's begin this journey. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to Unknown Lovely Tales and hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Like, comment, and share your thoughts because your support keeps these stories alive. Oh, no. Mrs. Bennet wailed, her voice breaking, clutching her son's lifeless body to her chest. She rocked back and forth, pounding her chest in unbearable grief. Curse your face! Why did you just die at birth, you witch? Her voice cracked with rage and agony. You've taken my only son from me. She gasped for breath, her sobs shaking her frail body. Oh God, if I had known, I would have smothered you the day you were born. I would have buried you alive. She clutched her son's face, stroking his cold cheek with trembling fingers. Oh, my sweet boy, my innocent boy. Her cries pierced through the small ranch house, a mother's soul torn apart. In the corner of the room, Emily sat, frozen. Her small frame shook as silent tears streamed down her face. She buried her face in her knees, her shoulders trembling with each breath. Her mother's curses stabbed through her like knives. But what could she say? If her mother's only son had been murdered, he was also her only brother. What had she done to deserve this? She hadn't flirted with anyone. She hadn't crossed any lines. She was just a victim, a prisoner in a world that had no mercy for the weak. Even in a place like Austin, Texas, where law and order were supposed to rule, the law of the jungle prevailed. A name haunted Emily's every waking moment: Duke Malone, a local thug who had taken it upon himself to make her life a living hell. Harassment every day, taunts nonstop, and when she protested, he killed her brother. Duke had no fear. He was untouchable. He strutted around town like he owned it, his voice dripping with arrogance. You're gonna be my wife, sweetheart. Once you finish college, you're mine. And if anyone tries to marry you before that, he smirked, his eyes dark with menace. I'll kill him and take you anyway. Emily was powerless. She couldn't fight back. She could only run. Every time she ran home, trembling, seeking comfort in her mother's arms. But those arms, they weren't there anymore. She was alone. Just a high school senior, barely 18, and with her father gone, she had no one left to protect her. And Duke, his name alone was enough to make the entire town shudder. Shopkeepers paid him protection money. Anyone who crossed him ended up dead. A ditch, a river, the side of a road, that's where they found the bodies. And the police, they were useless. When Emily and her mother pleaded with the sheriff, he only sighed, rubbing his temples. Don't worry, ma'am, I'll talk to him. His voice was apathetic. But honestly, your best bet is to just leave town. Emily's heart sank. Duke's a powerful man. He's got connections. He's untouchable. The words felt like a slap. Since when did law enforcement negotiate with criminals? Since when did they surrender? But that was the truth. Men like Duke, they didn't respond to pleas. They only grew bolder. Power corrupts, and absolute power, it destroys. Duke had enough power to ruin a poor girl's life, all because she was beautiful. Beauty in the hands of the powerful was a weapon, but in the hands of the poor it was a curse. Emily's beauty had drawn the worst kind of attention. First, the local troublemakers, then the boys at school, and finally, Duke Malone himself. She was modest, dignified. She kept to herself, ignored the catcalls. But her silence, it only made them bolder. Her brother Jake, he was her protector. A hard-working ranch hand, painting houses just to make ends meet. And when he saw Emily come home one day, shaking, crying, broken, something inside him snapped. Who's the bastard? His voice trembled with fury. Emily, barely able to breathe, whispered, "Duke Malone." Jake stormed out of the house. "Jake, don't." Their mother's voice shook with fear, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He marched straight to Duke's hideout, and he never came back. A kind truck driver, a distant relative, found his body and brought him home. Jake had tried to stand up to Duke, but all he'd done was trade his life for a shred of dignity. Now Mrs. Bennett was left to mourn her only son and her only daughter. "Why were you even born?" she screamed, her voice hoarse with grief. "I should have thrown acid in your face." Emily flinched. "If only you'd been scarred, my boy would still be alive." Her words were daggers. The neighbors tried to console her, but the loss of a child, it was too much to bear. A fire of hatred burned inside Emily, consuming everything in its path. Her fists clenched, her nails dug into her skin. She wouldn't accept it. The death of her brother, her protector. Sitting in a dark corner, her face buried in her knees, she sobbed silently. "Why, God?" She poured out her grievances to the heavens. But the heavens, they were silent. At times, she thought of ending her own life. Maybe then, her mother would find some peace. But what would that accomplish? Duke Malone would still roam free, still preying on other vulnerable girls. Her tears burned with rage. She didn't just want him gone. She wanted him to suffer, to beg for mercy, to grovel at her feet. But that was impossible. The law was powerless against him, and no one dared to stand up to him. The funeral was a blur of grief. Mrs. Bennett and Emily collapsed in tears, their wails piercing the air. Neighbors tried to console them, but the loss of a child was too heavy a burden to bear. Mrs. Bennett fainted, and when she regained consciousness, her cries started anew. Emily, broken beyond words, retreated into herself, silently pleading with God for justice. As night fell, the house grew eerily quiet. Neighbors slowly left, leaving the two women alone in their sorrow. A kind soul brought food, but neither mother nor daughter could eat. The food sat untouched. Time felt frozen. And then, late into the night, Mrs. Bennett reached for Emily. She pulled her into her arms, her frail hands trembling. "My darling, my precious girl, my moon." She showered Emily with kisses and tears. "Stop crying, my love. Your mother is still here." Emily broke. She collapsed into her mother's embrace, sobbing uncontrollably. Mrs. Bennett knew Emily wasn't to blame. She hadn't chosen her beauty. She hadn't invited Duke's attention. She was just an innocent girl, trapped in a cruel world. The two clung to each other, crying. As the heavens watched silently, God had made this world a place of trials, not instant retribution. If justice were swift, Duke Malone would have been torn apart by vultures long ago. But everything happens in its appointed time. The next day, a steady stream of neighbors arrived. There were no men in the house, so the visitors sat with Mrs. Bennett, offering what little comfort they could. Then, Reverend Jacob arrived, a man of God, a man of courage. He placed a gentle hand on Emily's head. "Find solace in God's will, child," he whispered. Then, turning to Mrs. Bennett, his tone grew serious. "Mrs. Bennett, this isn't the right time, but you should consider reaching out to the media." Emily's heart skipped a beat. If this story gets out, it might force someone to take action. His voice held hope. "I'll also try to rally the community. If we protest together, maybe the authorities will listen." Mrs. Bennett sat in silence. Then, without hesitation, she made her decision. The very next day, she went to a local news station. Outside, a news van was preparing to leave. She rushed forward. She told them everything. The reporter eagerly agreed to come with her. Finally, someone would hear their story. But when they reached home, her heart dropped. Duke Malone was already there, waiting, grinning. Someone had tipped him off. "How many of you have sisters or daughters in school?" Duke sneered, lining up the news crew. The reporter gulped. "Sir, we're just here to serve the public." Slap! Duke's ringed hand struck the man across the face. "Serve this," he barked. The reporter staggered back, spitting blood. Duke's thugs, they smashed the van's windows, they destroyed the cameras. The crew stood frozen, terrified. And then, Duke's voice dropped to a chilling whisper. This is your only warning. His eyes gleamed with menace. If I see any of you near this house again, I'll strip you naked and parade you through the streets. And as for the women in your families, he smirked. The threat was clear. The news crew fled, and then Duke turned. His gaze fell on Reverend Jacob, the only one who had stayed. I hear you've been stirring up trouble against me. His voice dripped with contempt. Emily, standing in the corner, fumed. She wanted him dead. She wanted him to suffer. Duke, fear God's wrath, the Reverend pleaded. Why are you tormenting this helpless girl? Duke grabbed the old man by his beard, threw him to the ground. Emily rushed forward. She helped him up, her eyes blazing. You're only brave when you're picking on the weak. Her voice trembled with rage. Duke laughed, a cruel, mocking laugh. Then find someone stronger to stand up to me, sweetheart. He spread his arms, grinning. Around here, everyone's weaker than Duke Malone. The Reverend, tears streaming, whispered, God is stronger than you. Duke smirked. I'm not fighting God. I'm dealing with insects like you. The Reverend clenched his fists. God's justice may be delayed, but it's never denied. Duke's grin vanished. Save your sermons for church. Then, his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. And remember this, if I hear even a whisper of protest from you, I'll come for your daughter next. She's in 9th grade, right? I'll make her my wife, just like I'm going to do with Emily here. The Reverend shattered. His innocent daughter threatened. His heart broke. He left without another word. Duke, he turned back to Mrs. Bennet. Listen, old woman. His voice was pure evil. Your little admirer has been put in his place. You better watch yourself, or I might just celebrate my wedding night with your daughter before the ceremony. His gang howled with laughter. Mrs. Bennet, she looked up to the heavens and prayed for deliverance. The pain of losing her brother was not just immense, it was suffocating. A hollow ache settled in Emily's chest, making every breath feel like a battle. But life doesn't stop for anyone's grief. It flows like a relentless river, unbothered by the mountains of sorrow it washes past, or the valleys of joy it briefly caresses. No matter how much she wanted to curl up and let the world fade away, Emily had to keep moving forward. She returned to college, her footsteps heavy as she walked the long, exhausting 2-mile journey each way. The biting wind stung her cheeks, but she welcomed the discomfort. It was easier than thinking about the emptiness left behind. There was no bus fare to spare. Her father's meager pension barely covered food, let alone luxuries like transportation. And now, with her brother gone, the weight of survival pressed even harder on their fragile world. Her mother, Mrs. Bennet, had taken to scrubbing floors and washing dishes in the grand homes of wealthier families, her once soft hands now calloused and raw. Emily's heart twisted every time she saw her mother return home, shoulders slumped, exhaustion clinging to her like a second skin. Emily had wanted desperately to quit college and help her, but the shadow of Duke Malone loomed over them like a storm cloud. His warning echoed in her mind. If she left school, he would take her by force. He wanted a wife with a degree, and until she had that piece of paper, he would let her be. Mrs. Bennet had even whispered one night through choked-back tears about selling their home and fleeing town. But where could they go? What place was safe from a man like Duke? Desperation led them to Mr. Thompson, a kind neighbor who promised to help. Within days, a real estate agent arrived, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning their modest home with a detached coldness. The moment he spoke, their hopes shattered. I can't give you more than $50,000 for this place, he said flatly, as if he were discussing the price of used furniture. Mrs. Bennet's breath hitched. Her voice, usually strong despite hardship, trembled. "Sir, this is our only home. We need enough to buy even a small apartment. Please don't take advantage of our suffering." The agent barely glanced at her. "Look, ma'am, this is a fair price. The house is small, and let's be honest, this neighborhood isn't exactly prime real estate. Take it or leave it." Emily's fist clenched, her nails digging into her palms. "Sir, this house is worth more than that. The land alone. 15,000. Final offer." The agent cut her off, his voice sharp, indifferent. Mrs. Rod Bennett's lips quivered, her hands trembled at her sides. "Sir, we're just a mother and daughter trying to survive. Please, have some mercy." Something flickered in the agent's eyes, guilt, maybe, but it was gone in an instant. He sighed heavily. "Fine, 20,000, but that's my last offer." The moment felt heavier than bricks on Emily's chest, but there was no choice. Mrs. Bennett nodded weakly, accepting the reality they had been forced into. The agent handed her his card. "Call me when you've made a decision." The next morning, with a heart full of resignation, Emily called the agent. But the moment he answered, his voice was frantic. "Please, don't call me again," he begged, panic lacing every word. "I can't help you. Duke Malone's men came to my office. They threatened me, said if I bought your house, they'd kill me. I'm sorry, but I can't get involved." Emily's blood ran cold. She gripped the phone tighter, her breath shallow. "No, no, please. You don't understand. The line went dead. Her hands shook as she turned to her mother, whose fearful eyes mirrored her own. "Mom," Emily whispered, her throat tight. "Duke found out. He's threatening anyone who tries to help us." Mrs. Bennett's shoulders slumped. Her lips quivered as she raised her trembling hands toward the sky. "Oh, God, protect us from this monster. We have no one else to turn to." The next day, they went back to Mr. Thompson, their last sliver of hope. But one look at his weary face told them everything before he even spoke. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Bennett." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Duke's men came to my house last night. They warned me to stay out of it. And then they said, if I cared so much about your family, I should send my own daughter to Duke instead." The room felt like it had lost all air. Mrs. Bennett swayed slightly, the weight of despair pressing down on her. The fight, the resistance, it was being drained out of her. She understood now that no one was coming to help. Everyone was too scared, too concerned with protecting their own loved ones. Emily's fists clenched so tightly her nails nearly broke the skin. Her heart pounded in her chest, burning with helplessness, with fury. "Mom," she whispered hoarsely, "what do we do now?" Mrs. Bennett exhaled shakily, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "We pray, Emily," she said, voice heavy with exhaustion yet filled with faith. "We pray for a miracle." When a beast develops a taste for human blood, it doesn't hesitate to attack an entire village. It doesn't stop. It doesn't fear. Locking your doors isn't enough. You have to stand together. You have to fight. You have to end the beast before it devours everything. But here, everyone was content to lock their doors, their trembling fingers turning the bolts, their terrified eyes peering through curtains, hoping they wouldn't be next. Hiding, always hiding, from Duke Malone, the predator who had turned their town into his personal hunting ground. Mrs. Bennett returned home in silence, her shoulders slumped, her heart weighed down by another failed attempt to escape. A month had passed since her son's death, yet every day felt like drowning in the same nightmare. The darkness was suffocating, and no dawn was in sight. That night, after the evening prayers, a shadow slipped into their house. Reverend Jacob. His face was pale, his movements hesitant, his breathing quick, like a man walking into a lion's den. Mrs. Bennett and Emily froze, their breath catching in their throats. He had come. Despite Duke's threats, despite the danger, he had come. "Mrs. Bennett," he whispered, his voice urgent, filled with worry. "You need to get Emily married as soon as possible. If you don't, that monster might do something unspeakable." Mrs. Bennett's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl, her voice shaking. "I've thought about it, Reverend," she admitted, pain laced in every word. "But who would marry her now? I'd even accept her being a second wife to a decent man, but no one is willing to take the risk." Reverend Jacob exhaled sharply, thinking fast. "Then we'll have to do it quietly," he insisted, leaning closer. "If we arrange a marriage in secret and send her away, Duke won't find out until it's too late." Mrs. Bennet shook her head, hopelessness tightening around her like chains. "I tried to sell the house and run," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But Duke's men are watching us. They beat up the real estate agent who came to see the property." A bitter laugh escaped her lips, hollow and broken. "We're trapped." Reverend Jacob's expression darkened. His hands curled into fists. "Is he watching the house right now?" "I don't know," she admitted, pressing a trembling hand against her forehead. "But that monster has taken everything from us." Reverend Jacob placed a firm yet gentle hand on her shoulder. His voice, though soft, carried the weight of unwavering faith. "God tests his people in many ways," he murmured, his eyes holding a quiet intensity. "But he never abandons his servants. For every Pharaoh, he sends a Moses. Duke's reign of terror won't last forever." Mrs. Bennet let out a shuddering breath, her lips quivering. "But what good will that do if my daughter is already destroyed?" "Don't lose hope," Reverend Jacob said, his voice steady as a rock. "God will provide a way." Tears welled in Mrs. Bennet's eyes. "You're our only hope, Reverend," she whispered. "No one else even speaks to us anymore." A shadow of sorrow passed over Reverend Jacob's face. "I'm just a humble servant," he said quietly. "I wish I could do more to save Emily from that monster." Mrs. Bennet had no answer, no words, only silence. Reverend Jacob stayed a little longer, offering what little comfort he could, before slipping away into the night. The next day shattered what little hope remained. Reverend Jacob had been found beaten, brutally, mercilessly. His bloodied body lay sprawled on the church steps, a silent warning to anyone who dared stand against Duke. Old Mr. Thompson, the first to arrive for dawn prayers, nearly collapsed at the sight. For a terrifying moment, he thought the Reverend was dead, until he pressed trembling fingers to his wrist and felt the faint, struggling pulse. Panic spread like wildfire. Mr. Thompson shouted for help, his voice cracking with urgency. Together with a neighbor, they carried Reverend Jacob to the hospital, their hands smeared with his blood. By the time Mrs. Bennet heard the news, he was out of immediate danger, but the damage had been done. Broken ribs, dark bruises covering his body, eyes swollen shut. He refused to file a police report. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew who had done this, and everyone knew there would be no justice. Not in this town, not while Duke ruled it with an iron fist. Fear gripped the town tighter than ever. The message was clear. No one dared to help Mrs. Bennet and Emily now. Even sympathy had been beaten into silence. When they stepped into the hospital room, their hearts clenched at the sight of him. His once strong, guiding voice was now barely a whisper. "I'm sorry," he breathed, pain etched deep in every word. "I couldn't do more to help you." Mrs. Bennet covered her mouth, holding back a sob. "You've done enough," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This is our fault. We brought this upon you." Reverend Jacob winced, shaking his head weakly. "Don't lose hope," he murmured. "God's justice may be delayed, but it is never denied." Mrs. Bennet let out a bitter sigh. "What if that delay stretches until Judgment Day?" Reverend Jacob had no answer. Some things were beyond human understanding. A week later, the hospital discharged him, but the man who left was not the same one who had fought for them. The bruises on his body would heal. The ones on his spirit would not. Reverend Jacob had been broken, not just by Duke's fists, but by the silence of a town that had once called him their shepherd. He had no fight left in him. He was leaving. Emily felt something inside her shatter when she heard the news. Their last hope, their only ally, gone, not because he wanted to abandon them, But because Duke had made it impossible for him to stay, the weight of despair pressed down on her like an iron cage. She couldn't focus, couldn't eat, couldn't bring herself to care about anything anymore. Except one thing: vengeance. She wanted Duke Malone to suffer. She wanted him to feel the same helplessness, the same terror, the same agony. She would pay any price to make it happen. But how? As she wandered aimlessly through town, lost in thought, she passed by shops displaying dresses she would never wear, shoes she would never own. She drifted through the bustling market, surrounded by people who lived normal lives, their laughter and chatter feeling like a cruel joke. She felt like a ghost, a shadow. And then she saw him, a black car, polished to perfection, a well-dressed man stepping out, a police officer holding the door open for him, armed guards flanking him on either side. Power, real power. Emily's heart pounded. An idea was forming, and this time she would not let fear stop her. And that was just the beginning. A tale of love, betrayal, and revenge that's only going to get darker. But what happens next? Will she find justice or lose herself in the fire of vengeance? To find out, make sure to subscribe to Unknown Lovely Tales and hit the bell icon so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep this journey alive together. See you in the next episode of Concubine, Love in the Shadows of Vengeance. Until then, stay tuned and keep listening to Unknown Lovely Tales.